This world is full of so much that will make you feel terrible. And one tiny thing you can do that I promise you will make you feel better is to listen. And then once you're a little better at listening, you can get a little better at sharing. And no matter how bad this world makes you feel, those things will make you feel better. Hi, friend. Welcome to the good world.
1, 2, 3.
So come on into a place that is fun. I'll be your friend and you can be mine. The world is a stream of constant bullshit, but that doesn't mean there's not a whole lot of good shit. You start with the lean and we can make something different. Let's build a world that is good.
This is a show for adults. So something I wanted to share today is a principle of neuroscience that I learned pretty recently. I think I've learned it before. I relearned it again from a friend of mine. It's called the Hebbian principle, Hebbian postulate. Sometimes the concept is sort of generally referred to as Hebbian learning. It's named after, that's H-E-B-B, it's named after a person named Heb. Heb! It's pretty fun to say. I suggest if you ever get a moment and you don't mind feeling a little ridiculous, Heb! Anyway, Heb, who, there's sort of a weird thing in our society where I'm supposed to, since I don't know Heb's first name, I'm supposed to know Heb's gender and assign a gendered pronoun, but I don't, and it's if you stop and think about it for a moment, it's like, why is that a thing that I need to know? We're going to go with doctor. We're going to assume that Heb, having come up with this principle, is a doctor of some kind, has a doctorate. Anyway, Hebbian principle. Heb is the idea that it's generally described as neurons that fire together, wire together, or cells that fire together, wire together. The idea is basically that in your brain is just a whole tangled mess of neurons and axons and all these different kinds of nerve cells. And basically what is happening is the way that your brain learns to connect two things is that the neural pathways associated with each of those things fire at the same time. So in terms of like really unpleasant things like trauma, an example that someone once gave me is that if let's say you're kidnapped, horrible experience, obviously very traumatic. If you're kidnapped by someone in a red shirt, then it may be that your brain connects the color red, the appearance of the color red with traumatic experience, and then even once you are rescued, wonderfully, the story has a happy-ish ending. It's happy-ish because you're still recovering from trauma, and that takes a while. It takes years of undoing. But the idea is that then, when you're out and around doing your thing in the world, if you see someone wearing a red shirt, your brain won't realize that this other person in a red shirt is not the same as the person in the red shirt who kidnapped you, and so your brain makes these connections. A more classical and common example, we will think of it in terms of dogs. Susie and I, in fact, have done this with Charlie. You've probably heard of the famous scientist Pavlov. And what Pavlov did is trained his dogs so that basically a bell would sound, and then he would give the dogs food. And what he eventually found is that the dogs would hear the bell and then they would see the food and then they would salivate. And what eventually happened is that the dogs started to produce saliva even if there was no food. They just did it in response to the bell because their brain had said, okay, bell means food. And that's how learning happens. And it's important to think about this in the context of generally how your brain works, because actually once you understand that principle, that basically, and there's some more complexity to it, and I am not a neuroscientist, I am not a Heb, but what I am is a person who understands some things and the way they connect to other things. When you think about the fact that your brain makes these connections this way, your brain, all it is doing sort of ever, and this comes back to what I talked about in the last video with how your brain kind of operates like an algorithm, all your brain is ever really doing is making associations between things. And then sometimes it can add a layer of sort of creative recombination on top of that. But for the most part, it's just saying, okay, this thing goes with this thing. And that's not happening consciously. That's happening way back. You are not thinking about it, but that is happening whether you notice it or not. From the moment you are born to probably to the time that you die. I mean, even people who suffer severe dementia, like their brain is trying to do that. It's just kind of the processes for doing that have broken down a lot. And I know I said I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm really not like a medical doctor. So don't take what I have to say about that as truth. Okay, Hebbian principle. Boy, also academic jargon. I feel like this comes up every time. I think we need to have like the jargon aardvark, which is just going to be like a creature that comes in and points out how ridiculous and opaque academic jargon is. Something happened there. We'll decide what that is later. So your brain is always doing this, and it's doing it whether you're aware of it or not. And that means that your brain can do can get you in all of these kinds of patterns that you are not aware of. And when I say you, I include me. I'm talking about all humans. We get into these patterns where our brain just sees one thing, makes a connection to another thing. It skips over the part where we have to think about it. And if you think about sort of why that is, it goes back to evolution and the fact that it was always really important for any living creature to conserve energy, and thinking hard about things takes energy. So your brain is saying, okay, well, here's one less thing to think about. Red shirt equals fear, panic, run away. So that's how that principle works. And that means the fact that your brain is sort of doing this, is making these connections, and those connections over time get stronger and stronger and stronger the more they're repeated. That's also the reason, for example, that you can do something like learn to play guitar. It's why I think I talked about this exact thing last week, but it's why you can start to play guitar and not be very good, but over time you can practice and get better, because those connections are getting stronger and stronger and stronger over time. And when you practice those things consciously, that happens with intent. And when you don't practice those things consciously, that happens without intent. And that is a really important thing to keep in mind. Those patterns in your brain are strengthening whether you direct them or not. They're doing it. And so it is actually pretty important to think about the ways that you can direct them, the ways that you can train your brain to get out of these thought patterns. I also want to share something that is going to seem a little bit unrelated, but I think it'll make sense pretty quickly. So in seminary this week, the main topic that we learned about was the mysticism of Passover, Pesach. And I grew up Jewish. I have this face. That's fairly self-evident. Often, just as a side note, when I meet people for the first time, it's very, very common for people to think, I feel like I've met you before. And my general response is, well, it's Jewish face number 7. In fact, when Susie and I went to Israel, we got off the plane at the airport and I was like, wow, it is Seths of all shapes and sizes. There's like a skinny, tall Seth over there and a skinny, short Seth over there, and a tall, fat Seth over there, and a short, fat Seth over there, and everything in between. But this face on different people. It was very, very strange experience. So we were learning about the mysticism of Passover, and something that I learned for the first time, I'm almost 40, but I learned this for the first time this week, despite having been to Seder's my entire life. The term Mizraim, which is part of the Passover Seder, it's used to describe Egypt, where the Hebrews were enslaved for some period of time, and there are debates about the historical record, but also there's a whole idea of absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. Anyway, it's a whole different road. But the word Mitzrayim, in addition to meaning Egypt and referring literally to a specific place on the planet, a geographical place, and presumably to an actual story of forced servitude, it also means narrow places. And you can take that and you can adjust it to be a metaphor, and it works really nicely as a metaphor for narrow thinking. It is effectively those habits that your brain is forming, whether you're training them or not. If you are choosing how to train your brain, it means you are using your freedom, you're using your autonomy as a human being. If you are not choosing how to train your brain is on its own getting trained by the environment all around us, and you are going to get trapped into these patterns of thinking. You may not even realize it. Literally all of us are trapped in some ways or another in patterns of thinking, and if you don't realize that, I have very bad news for you. Therapy can help, meditation can help. There are lots of books on this. I'm not the expert, but I do have my own experience of it, which is helpful sometimes to some people. But if you're not trying to actively train your brain, you're going to end up in these ruts, in these thought patterns. And that can lead to a lot of problems. And it in my life has led to a lot of problems in relationships with friends, in relationships with significant others. It's taken me a lot of work with Susie and in our marriage to sort of get myself to the point where I can understand that the environmental things that my brain has learned to think, oh, this thing happens, that means I get angry, and that means all kinds of other chaos. It's taken a lot of work, but I am now able, when I see those patterns starting, to sort of recognize them and breathe and interrupt and work through them. And that's the important part. Anyway, that sound means it's time to take a break. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back.
Please like and subscribe.
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 So, thought patterns, right? We get stuck in these really ruts. Metaphorical, but ruts. You understand, right? It's a wheel goes over the same place over and over, and it's hard for the wheel to move out of that same groove in the road. Our brains and our behavior are a lot like that. And something I've been thinking about a lot across the last week or so, it is both a really important thing in my own life and a really important thing that I've noticed sort of in our society at large, is that, let's call it elite education, right? Which is, I grew up, I think I've mentioned this before, I went to private school starting in third grade. All the way through college, I went to private university. Grad school was public, but it was a lot of fancy private schools along the way. And I don't love the term elite, but I don't know what else to use. It is also the term that the elites use, and I think we can acknowledge how self-indulgent that is. There's in addition to the elitism that like self-appointed elites have towards other people, there's also elitism within elites, where like people at Harvard will make fun of people at Cornell, and people at Cornell will make fun of people at Wesleyan, and it's all, everyone is just kind of trying to take out their insecurities on one another, if we're really going to be honest about it. Anyway, so in this world of elite, in this world of elite education, one of the things that is a really big part of the training, and I don't know how much this is a conscious choice on the part of professors and other students versus it's just sort of the way the environment shapes it. But if you are in a classroom and you're talking about a book or a topic in current events, whatever, the way to get the most positive feedback from the professor, generally speaking, is to respond really quickly and to say something that is different. Doesn't have to be right, just has to be different. You're sort of showing that you're thinking creatively, you're thinking independently, and you're thinking, most importantly, you're trying to show that you're thinking quickly. And here's the problem with that. It turns out that when you get out into the world, what that skill has trained you to do, the pattern that your brain has formed, the heb that has formed in your brain, is that you learn to formulate a response to something someone is saying while they're saying it. And I and my friends who I went to college with and a lot of people I know, we're all very, very good at this skill of standing there and someone is talking about something and we're thinking, yeah. And we're thinking, as they're talking, we're thinking, okay, what am I going to say in response? I have something lined up. I need to make sure I have something really witty lined up to say. Okay, they're done talking. Here's my witty thing. That's how this works. So that's the training we have, right? It's to listen and be ready to respond. And the problem with that is that if you're spending the time that you're supposed to be listening also getting ready to respond, you're not listening very well. You're actually not really listening to what the person is saying. You're picking up just enough so that when you respond, you can sound smart, in the hope that when you respond very quickly, they will say, wow, that was very smart and very fast. Good for you. I just want to sit with that for a moment and think about that. If you're talking to me, that means that you're telling me, let's say, something important about your life, and while you're doing that, instead of actually listening to what you're saying, I'm standing here thinking, Okay, I got it. 2 siblings. Okay, oldest sibling. Oh, I have a joke about oldest siblings. Every oldest sibling was a only child once. That's a joke I sometimes make at Susie's expense because she's the older sibling and I'm the younger sibling. But also, you can see how if someone is telling me about their life and I just hear the fact that they are the oldest sibling in their family, maybe what they said is I was the oldest sibling in my family, and also then I spent my entire life living in Antarctica. But I've mostly zeroed in on the part that I have a response to and that I can quickly formulate a response to. And if someone says, I was the oldest of 3 children and we grew up in Antarctica, and I respond by saying, oldest siblings are always only children for a period of time. First off, that version of it was a much worse delivery, less pithy, so they're less likely to respond by telling me how smart I am. But also, they just told me that they grew up in Antarctica, and all I could say was a joke about older siblings, because I wasn't really listening, because instead of fully listening, I was mostly listening while getting ready to respond. And that instinct, that habit, that formed pattern of neural connections, because we practice it over and over, because we spend a lot of not just years of our lives, but years of our lives when our brains are really forming, right? Like your late teens and early 20s, your brain is doing a lot of the learning that it's going to do. Your brain's going to slow down a lot after that. You can do things to practice it and keep that from happening, but like that is a period in time when your brain is super, super spongy and taking things in. And one of the things that you're doing if you're going to an elite school is you are training your brain to not fully listen to the person talking to you and to instead sit there and be ready with a response that will make you seem thoughtful and independent and fast. So it's not a surprise if you look at any op-ed page, any political punditry, any stupid debate in the halls of Congress, that people aren't listening to each other. They're talking past each other because pretty much all of them went to these same institutions where they practiced this exact same process, and they learned not to listen to each other all the way, but instead to listen just enough so that they can respond. And it's in our entire society. It's a huge problem. Last year, I went to a monastery. I went to Deer Park Monastery in Escondido, California, outside of San Diego. I went for a 3-day retreat. It was really lovely, lots of meditation, beautiful, beautiful grounds, incredibly wonderful, open-hearted people, great experience. Would strongly recommend it if you ever get the chance to go to a Buddhist monastery. I mean, there are different types of Buddhism. Deer Park was wonderful. And one of the monks who was really, really interesting, really insightful, and one of the things that he was talking about was, he said, I spend a lot of time trying to silence my critic. And what he meant by that is that as you sit there listening to other people, the critic is the little voice buzzing in your ear saying, okay, got to get ready with a response. Got to know what I'm going to say. Got to evaluate that thing they just said and evaluate that other thing they just said. And I'm listening to them, but I'm also thinking about what I'm going to say in response. Got to have an evaluation ready. Got to be ready with a snap judgment. That's the critic. And he said, I'm trying to silence the critic. I had never realized you can silence that voice. You can silence the critic. You don't have to just let that little voice keep chattering. And at first, it doesn't go away on its own. It takes practice, and mine comes and goes, but it's gotten better. But the more you sit there and practice the process of listening, which sounds so basic, but we are all really bad at it, the more you practice that, the better you get at it. And I have, for pretty much my entire life, been very bad at listening. I'm only starting to get a little better, and I struggle a lot, because my instinct, my heb is there ready for me to jump in with a response, and it's so hard for me to not do that. But every time I don't do it, it gets a little easier the next time. And every time I don't do it, and I really listen to the person that I'm talking to, I get so much more out of the conversation. I appreciate them so much more. When I do this with my wife, Susie, I appreciate her more, and I appreciate her a lot, but I could always appreciate her more. We can all appreciate each other more. But the most important way you can appreciate each other, the most important way we can appreciate each other, is by listening. And it's really hard to do that when all of our training, when all of our neurons firing over and over and practicing have trapped us in this Mizraim, these narrow patterns of thought that keep us in this same habit energy, doing the same things that our environment has conditioned us to do without ever even choosing it. It takes work, but it's so worth it. It's so worth it to stop arguing for the sake of argument just because it's what we know how to do, and to start listening to each other. And look, I know that that might seem a little silly coming from someone who is creating a YouTube show where he just stands here and talks. But there's an important corollary to the listening, which is the communicating, not arguing. Arguing is different from communicating. Arguing is a kind of communicating. But if we're really trying to communicate what is in our hearts, that's not arguing, that's sharing. And that's another thing we are not trained to do. We're trained to argue. We're trained to pick a thing we think and find evidence to support the thing we think, and then say, here's the thing I think, here's all the evidence, here's why I'm right. And that is very different from saying, I am a person, I am standing here, this is how I feel. That thing I just said is terrifying. It's hard for me, and I'm practicing it I'm literally here practicing it right now. I bet it's hard for you. But just saying, I'm here, I'm a person, this is how I feel, is important. And so even though I'm recording these videos where I'm standing here and talking instead of listening, I am trying to get better at practicing listening in my life. I can't do that by myself in here. That's something I have to do with other people. What I can do in here, in this shed, is practice sharing, practice opening my heart and just sharing it. And it's something that not only are we trained not to do it, but we see so often in our culture when people try to do it. I mean, what is the internet if not a place for insulting people who are just trying to be honest about who they are? So it's good that I'm putting this video on the internet. But it's a really important thing, and it's subtle, and it seems so obvious when you think about it. But also if you stop and sit with a moment, if you listen to what I'm saying, if you listen to yourself and what's in your heart and share that, you can see what I'm talking about. And becoming a better listener, which is slow, but I'm getting better, has also made me a better communicator. And so that's really where those two things come together. I think we underestimate how hard it is for one another to just honestly communicate how we feel. And we also underestimate how hard it is for all of us to honestly listen without judgment, without getting ready to respond, just listen. And that's because of our training. It's because of the environment and all of the ways that this world around us has shaped us without our even choosing it, without our consent, frankly. And there are a lot of ways to work on this, but the most important one is practice. And I know that's something I've said before, and it's something I'll say again because it's true. All you can do is practice. And this shed, this is my space. At some point I'll show you all the meditation altar I've been working on making. I really love it. And it's become part of my daily practice. I sit here and every day I just practice sitting. And I practice when thoughts come into my head, I practice saying, I don't need to think about that. I practice just coming back to the thing I want to focus on. And when I have a conversation with other people, I practice not responding. I practice being still. It's really hard. But if you practice it, you can get better at it. And if you get better at it, you'll feel better. This world is full of so much that will make you feel terrible. And one tiny thing you can do that I promise you will make you feel better is to listen. And then once you're a little better at listening, you can get a little better at sharing. And no matter how bad this world makes you feel, those things will make you feel better. I promise. And if you feel like you're doing that and you feel alone, just come back here. I'm here for you. I promise that too. I think my phone is ringing because I think Charlie's bath is done, so it's time to pick him up. So we're going to end right there. Ukulele. Well, thank you, friend, for your visit today. Now it's time we both go on our way. The world will still be insane tomorrow, but don't let that drown your heart in sorrow. You can thrive in a desert, just ask a saguaro. Please give to my Patreon. Capitalism is fun. Let's build a world that is good. This is a show for adults.